Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, guys. Please make sure you hit the like button on your way in. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, welcome. Please subscribe, hit the notification bell, hit it on all, and you will get all my videos as they upload. We are trying to understand the Mann Act. I did a part one. This is part two. The Mann Act has to do with white slavery of women. And whether it was consensual or non-consensual intimacy, these things you could still get in trouble for. This started back in 1910 with a boxer by the name of Jackson, and his girlfriend was traveling with her back and forth. They were upset. People got upset at the fact he threw a fight. Things of this nature happened, and the laws came about. The feds tried to get him. They got him. And now we're going to learn a little bit more about how it has changed over time. And I'm going to be breaking down this analysis and knowledge on you guys for the next couple of days. So it should be interesting to learn. Break out your pads, your pens, take little notes, learn. That's what we're here for. Education, right? Knowledge is power, right, guys? To all my members, if you're not a member, please join my membership. You can get some little perks. I will be starting a book club. I was going to read the Aaliyah story. Sorry about that, guys. I've been a little distracted. But we shall continue with the Mann Act Part 2. Now, unfortunately, I was having some issues here with playing this one page, so I'm going to read it to you as best as I can, guys. Now, this part of the chapter of the book talks about white slavery discourses. White slavery discourses. And it says that during the first decade of the 20th century, sensational white slavery stories quickly became fodder for public consumption, alongside news media, film, novels, and the allegedly non-fictional exposés by muckrackers. Reformers used white slavery rhetoric as a means of arguing for fundamental changes to American society, particularly concerning the protection of women and girls. Both male and female progressive era social reformers characterized prostitutes as victims. These women succumbed to the physical exploitation of men as well as the economic exploitation of society. Though some reformers acknowledged that prostitutes were rarely physically enslaved, they suggested that prostitutes were captive to a loss of freedom of will and of action. In the Great War on White Slavery, Clifford Rowe suggested that all prostitutes were white slaves. He made ostensibly scientific calculations that if there were 300,000 prostitutes in the U.S. and their average time spent in such a profession was 5 years, then every year 60,000 women would be required to fill the places of those who died or moved on to other occupations. This led him to conclude that white slavers were looking for 60,000 women and girls every year, which in turn resulted in a mass advertising campaign with posters warning mothers that slave traders looking to fill 60,000 empty positions posed an imminent threat to their daughters. By generally using the terms white slavery and prostitution interchangeably, reformers denied the possibility that women could consent, that women could consent to something deemed to be so abhorrent. And I'm gonna let the computer do the rest of the talking, guys.
To something deemed to be so abhorrent. Point 55. Therefore, they tended to view all prostitutes as victims, regardless of the circumstances, and to not see the women themselves as responsible. They were, after all, slaves. This belief about women's sexual victimization became one of the central elements of the Mann Act. Reformers centered this argument about the victimization of women on three types of exploitation: their inability to achieve financial stability, their lack of consent and control over their own bodies, and their political disenfranchisement. Although white slavery often signified physical captivity, some reformers also used the term to describe the socioeconomic forces that compelled women to enter an occupation that they would not, under other circumstances, have chosen. In that regard, use of white slavery paralleled the wage slavery definition previously used by white men. Some progressive reformers stressed the degree to which the actual problem of prostitution was one of economics. In House of Bondage, Reginald Kaufman repeatedly asserted that poverty and unjust economic situations for the working class left some women with no options other than prostitution. As Jane Addams wrote in her 1912 volume on white slavery, prostitutes epitomized that hideous choice between starvation and vice, which is the crowning disgrace of civilization. 56. In Ruth Rosen's analysis of statistical data on early 20th century prostitutes, she concluded that economic 55-44 factors were the primary ones in determining a woman's decision to enter prostitution. Point 57. A journalist and social reformer named Clara Laughlin attempted to demonstrate in a book called The Workaday Girl that low wages led women down paths that resulted in loose sexual morals, out of wedlock pregnancy, and prostitution. In response to those who argued that women would never choose prostitution for the money, Laughlin argued that women were instead lured into making bad decisions because of economic hardship, and those decisions led inexorably to the ruin of young women. Another curious misconception that many persons got was that when a girl may be said to have succumbed to the evil life because she could not get along on the wages paid her, she rose one morning and said, "I'm tired of the struggle. I'll go to the devil." They argued that a girl would not do that once in 1,000 times. Of course she wouldn't. That isn't the way they go. That isn't the kind of relation there is between low wages and going astray. Point 58. Laughlin saw a direct correlation between prostitution and women's inability to support themselves through respectable forms of labor. Laughlin argued that the bare minimum on which a girl could live independently, with no entertainment or luxuries, was $8 per week. In her study of conditions in Chicago's department stores and restaurants, she found that women regularly went to work for just $4 or $5 per week. Point 59. Many female social reformers and early feminists recognized that inequalities in work and pay, rather than white slavers or general immorality, often led women down. 45. The path to sexual immorality and prostitution. They work to expand the definition of sexual coercion to include economic forces. Women as ideologically different as Jane Addams and Emma Goldman argued that low wages and the exploitation prevalent in women's occupations made possible the coercion of women into prostitution. Adams provided illustrations from her Hull House settlement in Chicago, in which children suffered and eventually turned to prostitution because their mothers could not make enough money doing factory work to properly care for them. 60 Emma Goldman went so far as to point out the sexual economic exchange involved in marriage, as well. Point 61 to her, the traffic in women was merely another strain of capitalist exploitation. 62 Though this argument removed male slave traders from the equation, it still situated women as hopeless victims of a capitalist society. Emma Goldman, though she mocked the idea of white slavery, asserted, "What really is the cause of the trade in women? Exploitation, of course, the merciless Moloch of capitalism that fattens on underpaid labor, thus driving thousands of women and girls into prostitution." 63 Even those who were not radical anarchists, including Clifford Rowe, admitted that the pressure of low wages put many women and girls in situations that made them particularly vulnerable to the advances of disreputable men. 64 This economic argument about the forces that pushed women into prostitution did not, however, challenge the underlying premise that reformers generally believed women. 60 Adam, 46. Did not, indeed, could not freely choose to engage in illicit sexual behaviors. Whether they saw illicit sex as forced by male violence or coerced by limited economic options, middle and upper class reformers and legislators denied the ability of women to willingly engage in prostitution and, by extension, challenged the idea that women ever freely consented to sex outside of marriage. Marriage. As Pamela Hogg asserts, white slavery, in law and the popular imagination, did not so much deny agency as it charged that a woman's choice to ply the trade could hardly be seen as a free or meaningful, legitimate enactment of their will, given the social context in which it was made. 65. 65. Some reformers repeatedly turned a blind eye to what may really have been a matter of personal choice or economic necessity. Maud Miner demonstrated this in her record of the psychological examination of a prostitute named Evelyn at her rehabilitation home, Waverly House. Miner expressed consternation that, in spite of our efforts to help her after her release from a reformatory, she resumed her immoral living. 66 The conclusion Miner reached was that Evelyn was feeble-minded, thus implying that no woman in her right mind would choose prostitution over a more acceptable way of earning money. The way in which women seemed trapped in a cycle of prostitution fueled the images of captivity suggested by reformers. If women could not seem to easily escape from the social evil, it was because they were enslaved not only by individual men, but also by the disdain of society. Society. To this effect, Mrs. T. Curtis proclaimed that girls are kept prisoners not so much by the use of bolts and bars, perhaps, as by the fact that they know that, having been an inmate of a brothel even for a short time, they are 65 65 Ibid, 66. 47. Forever debarred from normal association with right-minded people under wholesome conditions. 67 In Jane Addams's work on white slavery and prostitution, A New Conscience, and an Ancient Evil, she demonstrated the way in which white slavery narratives situated prostitutes as victims of both men and society, with female social reformers as the ones offering them hope and rehabilitation. In discussing a girl from France who was deceived by a white slave trader into coming to America and working as a prostitute, Adams wrote, "It is as if the shameful experiences to which she was forcibly subjected had finally become registered in every fiber of her being until the forced demoralization has become genuine. She is as powerless now to save herself from her subjective temptations as she was helpless 5 years ago to save herself from her captors." 68 This was the quintessential image of the white slave. She was so weak and demoralized that eventually her captivity thoroughly pervaded her very being. This loss of a woman's control over her own body and soul was one of the major issues that reformers cited in regard to the women who were white slaves. Prostitution represented a woman's lack of consent to govern her own body. As historian Nancy Cott has demonstrated, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, consent was an essential part of American citizenship. In the minds of many Americans, therefore, prostitutes joined the ranks of such apparently oppressed women as the wives of Mormon polygamists. Point 69. It seemed to undermine women's rights to citizenship if they were not 60, 60, 67. Curtis, the traffic in women. 8. 68, 68. Adams, New Conscience. 21. 69. Nancy F. Cott, Public Vows, A History of Marriage and the Nation, Cambridge, Harvard. 48. Autonomous individuals in control of their own bodies. In a paper read before the National Christian League for the Promotion of Social Purity, physician Eli Peck Miller asserted that if this social evil was to end, women must have the right to govern their own bodies. Miller portrayed women as falling victim to the insatiable lusts of men, especially their husbands. This resulted in a proliferation of unwanted children, a problem which in turn resulted in depravity and eventually prostitution. Miller therefore proposed, it is only when women, married women, shall have a recognized right to their own bodies, a right to decide, when they shall become mothers, that this terrible evil will be allayed or overcome. 70. This right of women to govern their own bodies was presented differently by female reformers actively engaged in the campaign against prostitution. Intake warning. Catherine Bushnell cited Josephine Butler, the prominent British social reformer and suffragist, to validate her argument against the regulation of prostitution. Bushnell asserted that the problem with regulating prostitution was the same one Butler had encountered in fighting the Contagious Diseases Act in Britain. It entailed the compulsory examination of women who were, or were suspected to be, prostitutes. All women, even those in prostitution, she argued, had the right to govern their own bodies. Universe, 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 University Press, 2000, 132 to 155. 70. Eli, 49. The major political issues that social reformers linked explicitly to white slavery were demands for a living wage and for women's suffrage. In Mrs. T. Curtis's circa 1912 address to the Woman Suffrage Party of Boston, she asserted that women's suffrage was the solution to the problem of white slavery. She combined the argument for suffrage with a critique of social situations that resulted in the quasi-slavery of many working girls in urban areas. The solution, she proposed, was the enfranchisement of women, in which case these women would vote to change the laws that oppressed their working class 50 sisters, starvation wages, contribute their quota to fill the ranks of prostitutes. 5 out of the 9 free states have the minimum wage law, which prevents the criminal underpaying of women, and the idea of mothers' pensions, which first originated in out of the 9 free states have the minimum wage law, which prevents the criminal underpaying of women, and the idea of mothers' pensions, which first originated in a suffrage country, will, when successfully worked out, keep many girls from the streets. 74. In this vision of white slavery, the enfranchisement of women would enable them to rescue their sister women who were enslaved, both economically and physically, by the men who had the right to vote and did not use it properly. Female social reformers were uniquely situated in relation to the women they felt were physically and economically exploited by the white slave trade. Their class status separated them, but they shared an exclusion from full participation in the U.S. political system. While male reformers, many of whom were also politicians, did not share this sense of exclusion from full citizenship, many of them nonetheless supported the claims being made by female reformers. Dr. O. Edward Janney, chairman of the National Vigilance Committee for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, briefly argued in The White Slave Traffic in America that a living wage was one of the surest ways to check the rapidly growing trade in women's bodies. 75. In proposing this solution, Janney joined the ranks of many prominent female reformers who also asserted the necessity for increased wages to make women less susceptible to the coercion of white slave traders. The poor working conditions of women, which made them particularly vulnerable to the advances of white slave traders, enabled female reformers to assert that women's 74. Curtis, The Traffic in Women, 14. 51. Suffrage would end this economic exploitation. Although most male reformers did not argue this as directly, most did assert that the white slave traffic was a man's trade, not a woman's, and revolved around men's greed. 76 Such an admission of men's guilt gave female reformers room to suggest that women, if granted the right to vote, could provide the moral authority necessary to counterbalance the greed of men. This political imbalance was also demonstrated through the stories of bribery and graft told in almost every white slavery account. In these narratives, police and political bosses were depicted as, at best, turning a blind eye to white slavery and, at worst, actually supporting it. For instance, in his expose of the administration of Oakland, California, J.C. Westenberg asserted that police, government officials, and wealthy, respected businessmen were all in league with white slave traders. 77 Such political corruption allowed female social reformers to argue that white slavery would not end until women were granted full participation in the American political system. As will be seen in Chapter 5, this was an argument that women in the Pacific Northwest made particularly successfully, simultaneously gaining suffrage and launching a campaign to rid the city of prostitution and white slavery. Ultimately, all three of these issues, economic exploitation, a belief in women's inability to consent under certain conditions, and demands for suffrage, emerged in white slavery discourse as narratives about both the victimization of women and the unique ability of female social reformers to rescue and rehabilitate them. Most of this argument was made through the nonfiction works of social reformers in which they 52 outlined the problems of and solutions to white slavery. Nevertheless, two major works of fiction about white slavery, one a novel and one a film, demonstrated the relationships between women as victims and women as saviors. These tools of mass media reflected the concerns of progressive reformers by demonstrating in stark detail the primary issues involved in white slavery. Reginald Kaufman's sensational novel, The House of Bondage, traced the journey of a young woman who ended up as a white slave. Blue-eyed and russet-haired Mary Denby was a simple country girl who was deceived by a strange male into accompanying him to the city, where she was sold to a brothel owner. The young man was an alien with an accent who, the reader eventually finds out, had olive skin, black, curly hair, and was from Hungary. 78 Young Mary, naive, and from the countryside, had a fight with her parents, which provided the procurer with the opportunity to offer her marriage and a trip to the city. Once in the city, Mary was promptly turned over to the matron of a brothel and put to work. Eventually, Mary found her way back to her mother, but was rejected because of her fallen status. The end of the novel left Mary a human ruin, who was on the verge of death from syphilis. 79 Written by a journalist, this sensational novel was clearly intended to provide a moral lesson for all young women who might read it. Kaufman followed a standard theme in white slavery discourse by having the young white girl from the country be duped by a dark foreigner. Nonetheless, he also included significant elements of the story that spoke to the gender inequality at the root of white slavery. Kaufman's work 7853 provided a scathing critique of the socio-economic situation in America that gave women few viable employment options. Emma Goldman allowed that, because of this, Kaufman was the one commendable exception to the other reform writers who disgusted her. Goldman asserted that Kaufman proves that our industrial system leaves most women no alternative except prostitution. 80. Along with the critique of a social system that severely limited opportunities for women, Kaufman, like so many other reformers, portrayed the women in his story as playing multiple, complex roles. Besides being the victims of white slavery, the women were also the villains and heroines. Mary's mother and the brothel owner, Rose Legere, were as culpable as Max the Hungarian in determining Mary's fate. 81 Mary's mother was mean and spiteful, running a house that exacted everything and forgave nothing, causing her daughter to run away, and then later refusing to allow her to return home. 82 Mary's mother, of course, may also be seen as the product of a society in which she was not allowed the luxury of a pleasant attitude. Her life as mother and wife of an unpleasant man who ekes out a living in the iron mills was far from easy. Rose Legere, on the contrary, was more typically villainous, and was the individual most responsible for the physical captivity of Mary Denby. The women in Kaufman's tale were also the ones who provided Mary with the opportunities for physical and moral redemption. Through Katie Flanagan, who befriended her, though she could not ultimately save her, Mary was offered a glimpse of a 80 Goldman, the white slave traffic, 345. 81 Leger must be a reference to Simon Legree, the cruel slave owner in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. 82 Kaufman, The House of Bondage, 11. 54. Virtuous, religious, and eventually happily married, working woman. Katie struggled to earn enough money to keep body and soul together, while refusing to accept prostitution as an option. 83. Though she was not a social reformer, Katie played the role in this novel of the virtuous, autonomous woman set in contrast to Mary, the victim of the white slave trade. The racialization of the white slave trade is evident in this novel through the Hungarian who first deceived Mary, but the rest of the novel deals with the complex gender relationships in which independent, capable women attempted to save Mary from her plight. Other fictional accounts of white slavery were equally sensational, but portrayed similar activism on the part of women in rescuing their sisters from the villains of the white slave trade. In the 1913 silent film Traffic in Souls, Mary Barton was a virtuous heroine who, through her own ingenuity and persistence, and with the added muscle of her capable fiancé police officer Burke, did literally save her sister from a brothel. Mary and the woman known simply as Little Sister both worked in a candy shop, as well as cared for their invalid father. In progressive thought, women working in such public spaces were more susceptible to the bad intentions of men than were women working in more controlled factory spaces. 84. And, indeed, Little Sister was wooed by a man who came into the candy shop and told her how beautiful she was. In spite of Mary's warning, her sister spent a night drinking and dancing with the man, only to end up drugged and placed in a brothel. In this and other narratives, a more complete picture of victimization. 55. Is evident. The women who became victims in the progressive imagination often had some fault to begin with: vanity, love of dancing or movies, inability to understand English, feeble-mindedness, that resulted in their victimization. 85. This film portrayed Mary as her sister's savior. Fortunately, she arrived in time to give her sister the happy ending that Mary Denby did not have, and also depicted a version of white slavery in which white, native-born Americans were the enslavers. The other significant white slaves in the film were two Swedish sisters, literally just off the boat, and a bewildered country girl who could not find her way around the city. All three of these were enslaved by white men. Traffic in Souls gave no indication that these men were foreign, and, indeed, the man who masterminded the whole slave ring turned out to be the very wealthy Honorable Mr. Trubus. The vulnerability of women was compounded in this case by race and ethnicity. The Swedish girls were easily taken advantage of because of their recent arrival in the U.S. All of the white slaves in this film, whether foreign or native-born, were made particularly vulnerable by the intersection of class and gender. The women in danger in Traffic in Souls were immigrants, members of the urban working class, and girls from the country. The only young female in the film who is never in danger is the privileged daughter of Mr. Trubus. As with other white slavery tales, some women in this film were set in contrast to the female victims by embodying virtue and successfully combating the forces of the social evil. Mary Barton was the intelligent, composed working woman who caught Mr. Trubus, solved the mystery of where her sister was being held, and rushed to her aid with 85 Adams, New 56. The help of the police force. All of the women in this film were innocent and virtuous, with the exception of the wicked matron of the boarding house. Mary Barton demonstrated the sort of determination and autonomy that reformers believed was necessary to rescue women from prostitution. This film, therefore, displayed the major themes of white slavery discourse. It illustrated the economic exploitation of women through the poverty of the working Barton sisters, the physical captivity of the women kept as white slaves, and the political corruption that supported prostitution. In the midst of the victimization of women by these three forces, a particularly moral woman served as redeemer, affirming the assertion of social reformers that they were essential to the rescue of white slaves. Female social reformers claimed that women were victims of economic, political, and physical exploitation, and that greater rights for women, including the governance of their own bodies, a living wage, and suffrage, were necessary to defeat white slavery. Though Madeline Southard confined women's significance largely to raising children, she wrote in her collection of purity lectures that women needed good educations as much as men, because of their unique role in teaching girls. Point 86. This particular relationship between women and girls resembled the one elaborated by Dr. Miner in Slavery of Prostitution. She asserted that female probation officers were essential to her vision of helping wayward girls. 87. These girls, she suggested, could not be entrusted to male officers, and therefore she called for more women of strong personality, judgment, tact and faith, hope, love, spiritual insight, and a clear vision of the possibilities of the task. 86. Southard, The White Slave Traffic versus the American Home. 63. 87. Minor, Slavery of Prostitution. 222. 57. To work with the victims of prostitution. Point 88. Jane Addams, like many of her contemporaries, believed wholeheartedly in the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation for the women trapped in by the social evil. She criticized society for so readily believing in the innate degeneracy of prostitutes. Point 89. In her chapter on philanthropic rescue and prevention, she outlined how the Juvenile Protective Association of Chicago rescued women and girls who would otherwise remain trapped in white slavery. 90. She asserted that such philanthropic organizations, mostly led by women, were able to rescue these women because of their unique closeness to the problem. Those engaged in the rescue of the victims are able to apprehend, through their daily experiences, many aspects of a recognized evil concerning which the public are ignorant and therefore indifferent. 91. Ultimately, Jane Addams's strong belief in youth and innocence. 92. Resulted in a narrative in which she cast herself as older and wiser, the woman fighting for the redemption of her fallen sisters. She concluded her work with a moving appeal to her generation. At last lead one more revolt on behalf of the young girls who are the victims of the basest and vilest commercialism. As that consciousness of human suffering, which already hangs like a black cloud over thousands of our more sensitive contemporaries, increases in poignancy, it must finally include the women who for so many generations have received neither pity nor consideration. As the sense of justice fast widens to encircle all human relations, it must at length reach the women who have so long been judged without a hearing. Point 58. This final plea for the young girls who are the victims demonstrated Addams's faith in the possibility of reforming the society that she claimed had left some girls with only that hideous choice between starvation and vice, which is perhaps the crowning disgrace of civilization. 94. Although they perceived young, female prostitutes as victims of villainous men, social reformers also posited that women were the solution to the social evil and could offer a hope of redemption to their sisters caught in the white slave traffic. Social reformers, both male and female, argued that prostitutes were victims of a series of social forces: the physical exploitation of individual men, the economic exploitation of the workplace, and the political exploitation of corrupt officials. Reformers, predominantly female, used this victimization to make claims for increased rights for women. They asserted that increased control over their own bodies, the right to vote, and a living wage would give women the power they needed to resist the white slave trade. Ultimately, female reformers portrayed themselves as uniquely suited to rescue white slaves, and therefore as deserving full participation in the political and economic structure of the early 20th century United States. In so doing, they repeatedly made the argument that women were particularly susceptible to victimization and could not freely make moral choices when constrained by an exploitative system. In 1910, this latter argument became the foundation of the Mann Act. 94. Ibid. 49. 59. The Mann White Slave Traffic Act. Though a series of immigration laws defined the United States' legal relationship to the international traffic in women, no federal measures before 1910 dealt with the domestic white slave traffic. 95 The nationwide campaign against white slavery generated a great deal of support for a federal solution to such a grievous traffic in young women. Reformers had articulated a complex set of ideas about the victimization of women that included political disenfranchisement and the inequities of capitalism, yet the white slavery narratives primarily resulted in fear rather than social change. They created a great deal of concern about the possibility that young, white women could fall prey to sexually exploitative men or greedy brothel owners. Instead of addressing the underlying social issues that drove women to prostitution, Americans demanded a law that would stop these perceived predatory men from fulfilling their villainous desires. It is unsurprising that the impetus for such a law came from Chicago, the home of many of white slavery's most vocal opponents. It was there where movements for reform and purity collided with rapid urban, industrial, and population growth that muckraker George Kibbe Turner had brought white slavery to national attention. There, Clifford G. Rowe, the influential Chicago prosecutor, who would later write The Great War on White Slavery, proclaimed his fight against this actual slavery that deals in human flesh and 95, for instance, the Immigration Acts of 1903, 1907, and 1910, the Howell-Bennett Act, 60. Blood is a marketable commodity. 96 from Chicago also came Ernest Bell's Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls, which quickly became the authoritative text on white slavery, complete with 32 pages of striking pictures that showed innocent young white women being lured to their demise, kept behind bars, and, in some hopeful instances, talking to missionaries in vice districts and outside brothels. This book also referenced the new legal power destined to conquer white slavery, with a picture on the flyleaf of Edwin Sims, U.S. District Attorney for Chicago, described by the caption as the man most feared by all white slave traders. 97. James R. Mann, a Republican congressman from Chicago and friend of Edwin Sims, came to the rescue of the country's white slaves. Under the belief that the traffic involves mainly the transportation of women and girls from the country districts to the centers of population and their importation from foreign nations, Congressman Mann proposed enacting federal legislation. 98 as the chairman of the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce. Mann was in a unique position to argue that white slavery involved interstate commerce and therefore was subject to federal regulation. In his legal history of the Mann Act, David Langham records that the bill received little discussion in Congress and no debate about the meaning of its most notorious phrase, any other immoral purpose. 99 After all, the safety of women and children seemed to be a bipartisan issue. As one congressman from Tennessee declared, whenever I think of a 96 David J. Langham, crossing over the line, legislating morality, and the Mann Act, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1994, 27. 97 Ernest Bell, edition, Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls, or War on the White Slave Trade, Chicago, 1910. 61. Beautiful girl taken from one state to another, and drugged, debauched, and ruined, instead of being murdered, which would be a mercy after such treatment. I cannot bring myself to vote against this bill. 100 few congressmen were willing to argue against a bill that was designed to protect the innocence and purity of white womanhood. After years of campaigning, progressive-era reformers had achieved their goal of making the federal government intervene on behalf of the nation's exploited women and girls. However, the creation of the Mann Act meant that the Bureau of Investigation, attorneys, judges, and juries would now be the ones rescuing female victims, not the female social reformers who argued for greater equality. They had based these arguments on women's physical vulnerability, inability to make free choices in a coercive economic system, and political disenfranchisement. The result was greater protection for women, but not greater rights. Although it would bring the intervention of the legal system in the lives of ordinary Americans' women, it carried with it no meaningful social or economic reforms. The anti-white slavery campaigns upon which the Mann Act was based reflected the pervasive belief that women could not and would not ever freely consent to prostitution, and that therefore all prostitution was coerced or forced. Indeed, according to their rhetoric, It went against the very souls and natural moral purity of women to enter willingly into a life of shame and degradation. As one Colorado reformer asserted, no virtuous woman of any age, in her right mind, fully conscious of the consequences, ever did, or ever can, consent freely and voluntarily, without either physical or mental. 100 quoted in Connolly, The Response to Prostitution. 62. Coercion to give up the most precious jewel in the crown of her womanhood. 101 The congressman, who passed the Mann Act conceived of prostitution as something necessarily coercive, in direct contrast to marriage. Marriage, which was perceived as consensual. Prostitutes, in their coerced and therefore slave-like status, were not considered capable of the free consent and voluntarism requisite for American political allegiance. Allegiance 102 The rhetoric of white slavery therefore denied that women could consent to a sexual economic relation, discrediting this juncture as a site of individual choice or freedom. 103 This sense of coercion, as the opposite of consent, and as being particularly embodied by prostitutes, was one that would haunt the Mann Act throughout the early 20th century, casting women as victims, but also giving them a unique leverage over men. Men. 101 quoted in Odom. Chapter 2 Queen of the White Slaves. Women's Responses to Legal Definitions of Victimization. In the fall of 1913, J.W. Welch faced a judge on charges of violating the Mann White Slave Act. Accused of transporting a woman from California to Washington for the purposes of prostitution, concubinage, and debauchery, Welch eventually pled guilty after most of the evidence had been presented. However, like hundreds of cases that came before and after his, the circumstances of Welch's case differed greatly from the stories told by social reformers about white slavery. The victim in the Welch case was nothing like the innocent, naive young women Congress ostensibly sought to protect. According to the judge's memoranda, the woman Welch transported was a 28-year-old named Minnie Sepulveda, who had been working as a prostitute, for several years in cities on the West Coast when she met Welch. This 22-year-old young man grew up in the country, served as a blacksmith's apprentice, and was working in a grocery store when Sepulveda met him. The judge wrote that she became infatuated with him and they sustained illicit relations with each other, then moved together from California to Washington, using Sepulveda's sporting money to pay their way. 1 The primary motivation for their move does not seem to have been prostitution, and to whatever extent it did occur, prostitution was part of a lifestyle that predated the woman's relationship with the defendant. In the end, the defendant received an unusually light 1 U.S. 64 sentence, most likely due to the judge's belief that the female victim was not truly coerced or manipulated. The irony in the Welch case is that it plays out a classic white slavery narrative in reverse. The corrupting influence was a woman from the city who led a boy from the country down the wrong path. As the Welch case and many others demonstrate, the Mann Act institutionalized a double standard of victimization, in which the law denied any potential for men or boys to be victimized sexually, but simultaneously established that all immoral sexuality turned women into victims. This understanding of female victimization, combined with a broad interpretation of what it meant to be immoral, haunted many consensual affairs from 1910 through the 1930s in the United States. Contrary to the fears and assertions of progressive-era reformers, the archived Mann Act cases from the western U.S. suggest that only rarely did the female victims of Mann Act violations experience the brutality and captivity seen in typical white slave narratives, though subtler forms of economic and emotional coercion were sometimes present. The actual experiences of women involved in Mann Act cases were widely divergent from white slavery tales, and these women interacted with the legal system in ways that undermine the assumption of women's passivity embedded in the Mann Act. The women in these cases were not always the victims of a sexual commerce. Rather, some women actively claimed to be victims in order to attain a level of power or retribution, and others ardently resisted the court's attempts to define them as victims. Because the immoral purposes phrase of the Mann Act could be interpreted broadly, prosecutions quickly wandered far from the stated intent of ending the traffic in 65 women and girls for the purpose of prostitution. Although these broad interpretations resulted in the trials of thousands of people who were simply unmarried and traveling together, it also opened up an avenue of power for women who believed that they had been ill-used by male lovers or husbands and wanted to have the law redress their grievances. Such women loudly proclaimed their alleged victimization to legal authorities, while other women tried to fend off the definition of victim in an effort to defend the lovers with whom they had voluntarily traveled across state lines. The ill-defined wording of the Mann Act led to thousands of prosecutions that were far removed from the stated intent of the law. These prosecutions were created by, and in turn created, several convoluted meanings of female victimization. While the Mann Act criminalized the private lives of the very women it was designed to protect, it also became one side of ordinary women's struggle to combat the sexual double standards present in both the legal system and in their daily lives. Although social reformers and the legal system defined female victimization in ways that limited the significance of women's choices, a close analysis of several Mann Act cases reveals that women themselves thought broadly about the options this particular law made available to them. Indeed, these cases provide a rare opportunity to view the Mann Act from the perspective of working-class women and to glimpse their hopes and expectations, often in their own words. By responding in different ways to the idea that they were victims in these cases, women subverted the central premise of the Mann Act, that their consent was irrelevant, and that sexual relationships were controlled solely by men. 66. Consent and coercion. An exploration of how women and the courts attempted to define victimization in Mann Act cases reveals some of the ways in which gendered ideas of consent and coercion are legally constructed. Under this law, a woman's willingness to travel across state lines for immoral purposes had no bearing on whether or not the man with whom she traveled was committing a crime. As one prosecutor proposed for the jury instructions in 1914, it is not essential under the statute that force or compulsion shall be employed. She may go freely and voluntarily, and even of her own desire. The woman or girl may perform the act of buying the ticket for herself, or through a third person. Yet if the one charged has aided or assisted her thereto by furnishing the means, for the purpose denounced by the statute, he is guilty. 2 Like the age of consent laws which swept through the U.S. during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and made consensual sex a legal impossibility for women of certain ages, the Mann Act denied adult women the legal authority to choose whether or not to travel across state lines with male lovers. As Mary Odom noted regarding age of consent laws, this resulted in a very ambiguous legacy. The protection of women came at the cost of their equality. Reformers sought to protect young, working-class women, but did so by relying on an image of female passivity and victimization, and the moral protection offered by reformers demanded the denial of young women's sexual desire and agency. 3. 2 U.S.V. Vit. 67. The Mann Act extended this protection to all white women, of any age and marital status, who engaged in illicit sexual activity and crossed state boundaries. Even being married to the man did not keep a Mann Act prosecution at bay. When a woman allegedly engaged in prostitution both before and after crossing state lines with her husband, prosecutors in Seattle attempted to hold him responsible for it. As the prosecutor argued, the character of the woman transported is immaterial. The fact that she was the defendant's sick wife is immaterial, for this legal understanding of women's victimization resulted from a widespread belief that women never willingly chose to engage in immoral sexual behavior. This perspective was challenged, but not entirely eliminated, by the 1915 Holt decision, in which the Supreme Court determined that women could be tried for conspiracy to violate the Mann Act. 5. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, cases of female victimization were dealt with at the state level, primarily through various seduction laws, which handled the sexual assault cases that were more ambiguous than rape cases in which women were coerced by men's promises or positions of authority, rather than through physical force. The historical work on seduction laws makes it clear that they allowed for a level of nuance, taking into account that sometimes women pursued men and were therefore not victims. Brian Donovan demonstrated that by the early 20th century, these trials also took great pains to ascertain a woman's level of consent or resistance to a. For U.S. 68. Mann's advances. Point 6. Although white slavery was the legal and intellectual heir of seduction, the Mann Act diverged from seduction laws in significant ways. Point 7. While the discourse of seduction acknowledged the gray area between a freely chosen relationship and rape, the Mann Act did away with those distinctions altogether. Unlike in seduction cases, in Mann Act prosecutions, a woman's previous level of chastity was irrelevant, and the extent to which she willingly traveled across state lines with a man made her no less a victim in the eyes of the law. By the early 20th century, seduction cases pivoted on the question of a woman's consent. In contrast, white slavery narratives suggested that women were generally incapable of consent. These contradictions about consent and victimization were entrenched in and legitimized through the Mann Act in particularly gendered ways. The wording of the Act, with or without her consent, simultaneously acknowledged that women had the ability to consent and rendered that consent irrelevant and invalid. The Mann Act, therefore, reified the Victorian sexual double standard that identified men as sexual aggressors and women as victims who would not voluntarily sacrifice their virtue for pleasure or economic gain. The economics of victimization. Unlike the reformers and politicians who pushed for the creation of the Mann Act, the vast majority of victims in these cases were part of the working class. While middle and upper class Americans conflated all of women's extramarital sexual activity with 6 Brian Donovan, gender inequality, 69. Prostitution, young working class women had a much more fluid definition of respectable sexuality. At the same time, the working class women in these cases aspired toward middle class ideals, complete with all the trappings of a marriage and home. As Kathy Pice has demonstrated, working class women supplemented their meager incomes with a treating system, in which men would provide them with food, entertainment, or gifts, and would generally expect to receive sexual favors in return. Point 8. These charity girls viewed themselves as distinct from prostitutes, although economic motives were still the primary factor. Women's wage labor and the demands of the working class household offered daughters few resources for entertainment. At the same time, new commercial amusements offered a tempting world of pleasure and companionship beyond parental control. 9. Working class women, therefore, viewed respectable sexuality in a distinctly different light from those in the middle and upper classes, while the latter sought to define all illicit sexual activity as prostitution and all prostitutes as victims. The lives of working class women actively challenged such dichotomies. For instance, in one Mann Act case, a woman went back and forth with the prosecutor and the judge about whether or not she had been practicing prostitution. To them, it seemed clear from her answers that she had been. However, she maintained a distinction between occasionally. 8. Kathy Pice, 70. Entertaining men and working as a career prostitute. As she explained, I was making just enough to live on. I was not practicing prostitution. 10. Because of the very nature of the crime, Mann Act cases almost always involved women who were economically dependent on men and had relied on them to purchase the tickets and pay for the hotel rooms necessary for interstate travel. The letters exchanged between female victims and their lovers provide a snapshot of the various economic forces that constrained the lives of working women and which made it more likely that they would end up in a set of circumstances that the middle and upper classes deemed immoral and unacceptable. The woman who, whether through social custom or economic necessity, relied on a man to pay her travel expenses was at greater risk of exploitation, and the man at greater risk of prosecution. In the construction and enforcement of the Mann Act, the economic dependence of women was intimately linked to their physical and sexual vulnerability. Economics were also at the heart of working women's dreams for their lives. The 1921 case of Emma Robinson and Frank Levitt Arnold illustrates this tension between economics and sex that so powerfully shaped the lives of many young working class women. During the summer of 1920, Emma Robinson wrote almost daily to Frank Arnold, detailing her life and work in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Like the young women described by Kathy Pice in Cheap Amusements, Robinson enjoyed many leisure and entertainment opportunities while on outings with her female friends from work. She also insisted to her long 10 U.S. 71 distance sweetheart, Frank, that she was not going out with any guys while she enjoyed the pleasures of Atlantic City in the summertime. Robinson's letters, however, reveal much more about economic hardship than they do about leisure. As a 25-year-old waitress, she made just enough money to sustain herself, and not enough to save much. Her letters were filled with two primary economic concerns: saving the money she needed to divorce her husband, and getting enough money to join Frank Arnold in the state of Washington. 11. Though Emma Robinson and Frank Arnold were just acquaintances when the summer began, their friendship grew quickly into romance through their extensive correspondence over the course of several months during 1920. Emma's letters told the painful story of her infant son's death 2 years previously, and her subsequent abandonment by the husband who had treated her like a dog. 12. As she described to Frank: "Since I saw you last, Frank, I have had a lot of trouble. Mr. Robinson left me last April for another he thinks he likes better, and I have not quite got over the shock as it was so sudden, but am at home now, and trying to forget about it." 13. Emma's letters frequently returned to her running problem: how to save the $75 required to obtain a divorce from the husband she had not seen in over a year. Her letters reveal a mix of excitement about starting a new life with Frank, melancholy about moving so far from her parents and siblings in Philadelphia, and worry about the stresses of life on a meager income. When Frank hurt his foot and could not 11 USV 72 work for a few months, she expressed much concern about his physical well-being, but also responded to what was obviously a grave concern about their financial prospects. In a couple of letters, she answered questions that Frank had apparently posed about whether or not they could be married given their poverty. She assured him that she wanted to marry him regardless of their finances. "In the first place, I didn't expect to marry a man of well means, for I am only of a poor man's family and have to work for a living. If I come out there, I am willing to work and help to get a start in life, then afterwards we may take it easier, that is in our older years." 14. In another letter, she continued trying to assuage his fears. "Yes, I think us two can live as cheap as one, and when I come out I would be willing to work until we would have a little laid aside for a rainy day, as I believe all women should work and help their husbands until they have a little laid aside. Then it would be all right for her to quit. Am I right?" 15. Emma repeatedly expressed a desire to be officially divorced before she joined Frank, which she viewed as the only respectable way to begin their lives. Then they could get our home together and go right to it, and will bother no one. 16. However, as the months dragged on and Emma did not have the money to acquire a divorce, she eventually urged Frank to send her a train ticket so that she could join him in Washington. Frank did pay for a train ticket for her, and their correspondence ended as they were at last reunited in person. That was, however, far from the end of the story. Emma put her feelings about Frank to paper in a much different situation just 4 months later. 14. Ibid. Letter dated 73. In February of 1921, while staying at the Pacific Coast Rescue and Protection Society in Seattle, Emma gave an official statement to an agent of the Bureau of Investigation. Although it is impossible to know how true her version of events was, her statement is useful in showing how women shaped their narratives of victimization to elicit support from the legal system and to potentially punish the men who allegedly victimized them. Emma's statement also reiterated some of the themes of her earlier letters to Frank: the crushing burden of poverty, from which she was always struggling to escape, and the ways in which that poverty forced her into a less respectable life than the one she wanted. As Emma told the agent, "Frank has coaxed me to come to Charleston, Washington, for the purpose of marrying him, stating that we would have a home of our own there." 17. Emma's letters and her statement to the FBI make it clear that she was desperate to get married for more than just romantic reasons. For her, and many other women, marriage was the key to respectability, to financial stability, or at least survival, to dignity, and to the creation of a home, with all of its physical and emotional connotations. When this dream collapsed, Emma, like many other women, sought to use the legal authority of the Mann Act to punish Frank. According to Emma, she lived with Frank at his parents' house for about 4 months after she arrived in Washington. She claimed that Frank only worked for about 3 weeks during that time, and that she was responsible for doing all of the housework, and laundry in exchange for her room and board. Meanwhile, Frank and his mother allegedly harassed her about finding a job, and although she looked, she could not secure. 17 emphasis added. Frank Arnold, hashtag 31-1586, Bureau Section Files, 1909 to 21, Investigative Reports of the Bureau of Investigation 1908 to 1922, National Archives and Records Administration M1085. 74. 1. When she felt sick, Emma went to the doctor and found out that she was 4 months pregnant. According to her, Frank's response to that news was to deny that the baby was his and stop speaking to her. After quarreling with Frank's family, Emma found a room with a sympathetic woman across the street, who said she would hold Frank responsible for the cost of the rent. Frank then left town. 18. Although there is no record of how or why Emma ended up at the Pacific Coast Rescue and Protection Society, PCRPS, the usual function of such organizations was to help single, impoverished women through their pregnancies, and to reform them at the same time. We do know one thing about Emma's stay at the PCRPS, that a blood test confirmed she had syphilis. No transcript exists of Frank Arnold's trial, but Emma had told the FBI agent that Frank insisted that the child was not his, and that he believed Emma was pregnant before she came west. Perhaps Frank's lawyer used this argument, or maybe he emphasized that Frank could not legally marry Emma because she still had not finalized her divorce. Regardless, the jury found enough reason to doubt Emma's story and returned a verdict of not guilty. 19. Although there is no way of knowing what truly transpired between Frank and Emma, her story does offer a look at the economic hardships that pushed working-class women to cross the bounds of what they believed to be respectable behavior. Emma apparently never engaged in anything approximating professional prostitution, but she did live with a man to whom she was not married, which seemed a similar offense to early 20th century Americans. Other working-class women, however, did clearly. 1875. Use prostitution as a way of making ends meet. While some women worked regularly as prostitutes, many others used occasional prostitution to fill the gaps in their meager incomes.